both written papers. They're both on the web page, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And Bob is going to read an abridged version of his paper, and then I'm going to make some remarks about my paper and from my paper and from some of the other things that have happened in the conference that I think need to be addressed. So that will shift the ground a little bit in terms of how we might discuss this. So we're going to flip the order that you may have expected when you came here. That's not what's going to happen. It's going to be the other way around.
To tell you a little bit more about myself before I do an official read. For the last 20 years of my checkered career before I retired, and that was 10 years ago I retired, I was an elementary school counselor in the rural area of eastern North Carolina in Nash County. Rocky Mount, North Carolina, some of you may know, is in Nash County, and I was in, at some points, predominantly white kids, and at one point, predominantly black students. And my means of engagement was play therapy. And one day, a kid, Billy, came in, about 9 years old. And I had an office that was not much further than from here to the blackboard to the principal's office. And the principal was a new young woman whom I didn't know. And because I was using play therapy and doing rather more therapy than traditional counselors do, I felt that I needed to always, with a new principal, you've got to convince them that if you're having kids in who have problems and you're playing with them, what the hell is that? Okay, so right across from my office, across the hall, was the faculty bathroom. This child, Billy, started screaming and squirming and so on in his chair, and I said, Billy, you need to go to the bathroom. Yes, I really need to go. And I said, well, could you make it back to the boys' bathroom? That was quite a ways, actually. No, I can't do that. So, with fear and trepidation, I go open the door of the faculty bathroom. He goes in, I close it, and I leave my door open. It's just as if that door were open. Right across the hall, there's a closed bathroom door. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited some more. And I was alarmed at some point because I thought the kid might be sick. Maybe he passed out. So I go and knock on the door. Billy? Yes. Are you okay? Yeah, I'm okay. Okay. So all right, I go back to my room. By then I'm sweating it because what faculty member is going to come down and try to get in, and Billy's in there and who knows what, and I'm going to be in a shitload of trouble, and so to speak, and so I go back and knock again. Billy, are you all right? Yes. Finally, I hear this shriek. Mr. Bob! Mr. Bob! Come in here! Come in here! Oh God, am I scared then. I am petrified. What has he done? I open the door. Come here, come here. Look at this. And the toy. That's the best turd I have ever made!
I can't believe it.
And I look down at it and I say, oh my Billy, that's fantastic. You have, that's a perfect one. I can't believe it. And ladies and gentlemen, to this day, that is the most perfect turd I have ever seen.
And did the principal overhear?
I have no idea. But if so, she never said anything about it, nor did anybody else come along. But Billy got his affirmation from Mr. Bob for his magnificent production.
Does that give us permission to tell any jokes we want to tell them?
No, I'm facilitating here. We've got limits, we don't know what they are, but we've got them. We don't know.
So we're gonna understand the significance by the end of your
We just
presentation.
can't cheat.
That's no cheating.
All right, sitting in a classroom on the
Well,
Yale
yes.
Divinity School campus 56 years ago, give or take, I asked Brown Barr, professor of homiletics, what good are words? Looking back in a homiletics class, it was an impertinent, everybody knows the answer to that kind of question. Nevertheless, it was a question that troubled me because I had lost faith in the bearing of words on reality. Professor Barr, to his great credit, suggested I needed to consult a philosopher. It turns out that 6 years later, the person I met who had thought deeply about this taken for granted commonsensical question was Bill Poteat. That meeting was considerably after I had ironically plunged into the exploration of counseling psychology based largely on the discoveries of Freud, the founder of the talking cure, whose medium of exchange relies heavily on the power of words to reveal a certain kind of reality. Regarding Freud, it was Poteat who said it's, quote, it's only because believing, even neurotic believing, is a transaction that must occur in the interpersonal universe of speech and personal identity that psychotherapy, by means of talking and a form of acting out, can enable one who owns his beliefs to come to own up to them. It's all of this that makes the Freudian use of cause so odd, so revolutionary, and so productive. It's a cause that can be dissolved with a word, unquote from Poteat. When I first read these underlined words, tears of recognition came to my eyes. I felt the emotional power of their impact before I was able to articulate the meaning. What Poteat is referring to in this cryptic statement is that Freud's use of the word cause is actually a rejection of the explanation of neurotic beliefs as caused by lesions in the central nervous system in favor of cause, which refers to neurotically engendered beliefs which are capable of being dissolved through first-person dialogue between patient and therapist, and interpersonal dialogue in which actions and reasons, not neurophysiological causes, have cash value. However, as soon as Poteat says these words about the healing power of words, he points out that, quote, as valuable as words may be, the shape of the world in which we live is not given only, perhaps not even primarily in concepts. Characteristically, he says that the shape of our world is lived in and through our bodies, our choices as they're manifested in our actions, our movements, routines, rituals, shapes, colors, sounds, joy, depression, anxiety, our way of feeling in the world. The rhythms of our being at home here have some kind of order and therefore may be thought of as having some kind of syntax. Here Poteat footnotes Erich Fromm, a Freudian psychoanalyst, in a book titled The Forgotten Language, who speaks, Poteat's word, unhesitatingly of the non-conceptual ordering of our world after the analogy of language. Poteat goes on to say, these structures cause each of us to take hold of our world in one way rather than another. This idea of taking hold of our way in one way rather than another is very important to Poteat, and we'll come back to it later. Continuing to emphasize the non-conceptual dimensions of being human, Poteat asserts that each man's own existence is essentially the enactment of a drama having for its stage both the conceptual and the non-conceptual. If it weren't so, deep personal disorientations of the sort with which psychoanalysis has to deal could quite simply be cured by bracing verbal clarification, an attempted translation of the symbolic into the verbal. Poteat says there's a very strong hint of this in Freud's theory, in contradistinction to his practice, of which he was a bad observer, a constant
About
theme
which I
of
will say the same thing in a different way.
good. Reinforcing is good.
Yes.
If,
An agreement is good.
that's also it's a plus. benevolent.
That will validate some of what we're trying to do.
If, quote, bracing verbal clarification is not enough to overcome deep personal orientation, then what more is required in the psychoanalytic enterprise? Poteat hints at this when he says that psychoanalysis operates not only by talking, but a form of acting out. The references to the fact that the patient will act out in her relationship with the therapist patterns of her disorientation, opening the process to the non-conceptual or feeling level in which tone, rhythm, mood, posture, gesture, facial expression, anxiety, fear, depression, and all the tacit features of human interaction are present. Analysts call this process the transference. Erik Erikson says that Freud, after observing some patients who in hypnosis suggested that he, Freud, stop interrupting them with his authoritative suggestions, that when he did, they unearthed memories and affects he would never have suspected. Erikson says then Freud came to realize if he treated them like whole people, they would learn to realize the wholeness which was theirs. He now offered them a conscious and direct partnership. He made the patient's healthy, if submerged part, his partner in understanding the unhealthy part. Poteat puts that this way. There is a sense in which we may say that the neurotic is a creature of a world of his own imagination to which he then becomes subject, incarcerated as a prisoner. The job of the therapist is, as an outsider, to invade that world and to enhance his patient's wish to be free. The invasion, says Poteat, is a kind of incarnation, for the therapist enters the neurotic's world from the outside and remains while in it an outsider, lest he, like his patient, become the subject of that world, powerless against it. Poteat expands this analogy, saying that we are prisoners of the picture each of us has of what the world is like. We are defensive and anxious before any invasion of it. We can be set free only when that picture is ravished by reality or by God. How could Poteat use Freudian concepts in good faith when so many of Freud's ideas have been rejected as mechanistic, reductionist, and so on? Poteat looks at it this way. Based on Freud's self-observation and recurring evidence from his patient's memories of sexual affects and fantasies, and the transfer of an early father image onto later individuals, it is Freud the humanist who remembers Sophocles' drama of the Greek tragic hero Oedipus and uses its heuristic potential to illuminate the neuroses of his patients, and in so doing chooses what for Poteat is one of the signal achievements of ancient Greek drama, the elevation of the human being to a position where he's seen as performing an act of freedom from the world of necessity by playing let's pretend, thereby intimating some sense of the pronoun first person singular, some sense of what it means to be a person. Contrary to critical philosophizing, says Poteat, the Oedipus complex shows us that mind is not just consciousness, but as Augustine said, man is a great deep. And the Oedipus myth reminds us that we are not only mysteries to ourselves, but also that we repress and rationalize painful, anxiety-producing truths about ourselves. In a typically elegant way, Poteat affirms the stance of Freud, the analyst, when he says that even in the case of neurotically engendered belief, there's an ownership of the words and the acts. The person holding them is responsible, or at least proto-responsible for them, actually responsible in one way, potentially in another. He is taken by Freud, the analyst, as proleptically responsible. No account, says Poteat, of neurotically engendered beliefs which lacks this built-in logical tension and complexity is Freudian, and he continues, and I will say, neither is it really believable. With this linguistic analysis, Poteat has preserved the post-critical legitimacy of psychoanalytic discourse insofar as it attends to its healing task and to a non-reductive understanding of human development. Pursuing the dimension of human development, Poteat says the child who knows what it is to be securely and lovingly held lives, moves, and deploys his body and expresses himself in action in a very different world from one who has never known this. Although he gives no specific reference for this assertion, elsewhere in a footnote, Poteat refers to the illuminating work of a Freudian psychoanalyst, Erik Erikson, as set forth in Erikson's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Childhood and Society, a work which elaborates and extends the insights of Freud, the doctor, as Erikson called him, for understanding human development from childhood forward in its individual, social, and cultural manifestations. Poteat says of Erikson that his quote-unquote psychological reflections upon our ways of being in the world are of great import. They are, quote, cognate findings of Polanyi's tacit explicit proximate distal poles being primitively given. That's Poteat talking about Erikson. The operative words here for our purposes are primitively given, as in archaic, as in the natal matrix and infancy, the primitive linguistic substratum, the time in which the infant, for better or worse, is experiencing what it feels like to be alive in the world, to live in the world, to be in the world in one way rather than another. For both Poteat and Erikson, the primal ground, the bodily beginning, the progenitor of human being is the natal matrix and infancy. Erikson rejects the narrow, positive approach to psychology, regnant especially in his time, and the separation of psychology from biology and from the social sciences, preferring instead to study the process of human life. This approach bears great similarity to Poteat, who speaks of the inherent interest for us of psyche, socius, and polis as the arena of human action, as manifestations of our human personal context from which we mind-bodily demand a larger meaning, a human meaning which Erikson gives in an incredibly persuasive way in the elaboration of the 8 ages of man to which Poteat refers specifically. Careful to point out that he is referring only to the communal and psychosocial side of religion and not, for example, its spiritual aspect. He's no Freudian reductionist. Poteat was very critical of the Freudianism of some of Freud's followers, whose rigid views he characterized as various kinds of critical absolutism, including abstraction, which is identifying thought as such with its embodiment in language, ecumenism, which seeing an object as a finite totality, and ontological monism, which decontextualizes its object. Although Poteat does not criticize Freud himself for such rigidity, Poteat recounts a beautiful story of an Armenian family tragedy and triumph, in which he points out that Freudian categories, as important as they may be for psychotherapy, cannot encompass the full meaning of the richly complex lives and histories of persons. Poteat affords a very important additional illustration of this point with regard to the psychoanalyst himself in a discussion of the relationship between Freud's theory and his practice, when he says that as between theory and practice there is a tacitly supplied tertium quid, which is the practitioner himself, with all his complex or her complex life and personal history, much of which he, in the case of Freud, is only tacitly aware, but all of which has some bearing on his interchange with patients, a dialogue which explicit stated theory does not and cannot exhaustively explain. Poteat's most pointed critique of Freud is as follows: even so great a genius of Freud, says Poteat, the contemporary articulator of the profound importance of the non-conceptual world and what we rather simple-mindedly call the irrational, betrays the power of rationalism over his own imagination by repeatedly implying that the norm for human existence is the power by which man has to conceive that the rational or conceptual grasp of the etiology of one's past is that by which man becomes human, rather than the far richer notion that man becomes human through the capacity for assuming responsibility, for taking his past upon himself, for speaking in his own name, for saying I. I would say that the very important corollary of this assumption of responsibility for oneself is that in the wider verbal culture is a Poteat concept. In that wider verbal culture, it's the antecedent, non-conceptual openness and responsibility of persons to one another that is the common ground of their relationship, a relationship which must be acted out. This is also the ground of genuine psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. Concluding part one, I want to read part of a poem in memory of Sigmund Freud that Poteat liked and written by W. H. Auden. He wasn't clever at all. He merely told the unhappy present to recite the past like a poetry lesson, till sooner or later it faltered at the line where long ago the accusations had begun, and suddenly knew by whom it had been judged, how rich life had been and how silly, and was life forgiven and more on, able to approach the future as a friend, without a wardrobe of excuses, without a set mask of rectitude, or an embarrassing, over-familiar gesture. I begin the second part, which is Poteat's psychoanalytic allies. I begin with a quote from Richard Simpson, who's a psychoanalyst. Psychoanalysts deal with people only by the grace of words heard and said. It appears to me that some of Poteat's staunchest allies in recovering the ground lost in the Cartesian advance are to be found in the ranks of contemporary psychoanalysts and psychotherapists. They are explorers of the philosophical, psychological primal ground which Poteat sought to recover. Their concerns in many ways are his. I believe Poteat sensed accurately the heuristic potential that the Freudian enterprise of psychoanalysis, especially as elucidated by Erikson, held not only for confirmation of his Poteat's own findings, but for the extension and elaboration of those findings. Let's look at some examples. First, with regard to Cartesianism. In a remarkable work titled Worlds of Experience, that's written in 2002, three prominent analysts, Stowrow, Atwood, and Orange, launch a frontal assault on Cartesian influences on psychoanalytic theory. They launch it with these words: our aim is twofold. First, to expose and deconstruct the assumptions, largely a legacy of Descartes' philosophy, that have undergirded traditional and much contemporary psychoanalytic thinking. And second, to lay the foundations for a post-Cartesian psychoanalytic psychology grounded in an intersubjective contextualism. In this work, Stowrow et al. Launch a thoroughgoing and devastating critique of Cartesian isolated mind thinking, beginning with Freud and extending through contemporary psychoanalytic theory, drawing on philosophical resources found in Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, Wittgenstein, William James, C.S. Peirce, H.D. Gadamer, Charles Taylor, and Michael Polanyi. A postmodern philosophical stance not unlike that of Poteat and Polanyi, which they call perspectival realism, seeing truth as gradually emergent in dialogic community. Orange, in a work entitled Emotional Understanding, relies heavily on Polanyi's concept of tacit knowledge for the foundation, her word, of her understanding of emotional memory. Emotional memory refers to the critical importance of the emotional component of knowing, which is sensory motor and affective, present in infancy prior to language, continues throughout life, not as the precursor of representational or symbolic cognition, but as the core of our knowing. The title of a book of essays written by a group of 8 prominent Canadian and American analysts, The Embodied Subject, Minding the Body in Psychoanalysis, should pique the interest of Poteat scholars. On the very first page of the introduction, one of the editors, John Muller, says, "My basic premise is that only a speaking being can be embodied. in contrast to the views of embodiment in which mind is in a brain or a brain is in a body, as if embodiment is equivalent to physical containment. And that's just for openers with mouth. One of the contributors, Roger Free, who is co-editor of the International Journal of Self-Psychology, in an essay titled The Lived Body, From Freud to Merleau-Ponty and Contemporary Psychoanalysis, begins his essay as follows. I argue that Merleau-Ponty's conception of the lived body has come closer than most to collapsing the Cartesian duality of mind and body. His philosophy of the lived body demonstrates the way in which understanding and awareness, communication, are all fundamentally embodied. For this reason, I suggest that his ideas, says Free, are particularly relevant for helping psychoanalysts close the gap between intellect and soma. The work of British psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott is particularly instructive for its heuristic value when contemplating what I've termed Poteat's philosophical primal ground. The heuristic potential is enhanced by the fact that in this instance, Winnicott's ideas are advanced in a philosophically astute, quote-unquote, afterword of a work that is considered to be the best criticism ever written of Robert Frost's poetry, Richard Poirer's Robert Frost's The Work of Knowing. In Winnicott's experience with infants and mothers, he became aware of what he termed transitional objects, which really referred more to transitional states than objects. He noticed that the child has an enormous subjective and creative investment in these transitions. The essential transitions are these. The infant initially has a sense of being merged with its mother. It then attaches itself to an external object, usually the breast, which is felt by the infant to be part of itself. It then moves from this to an object even more external, anything soft and fondable like a doll, a blanket, a toy, which is endowed with some associations attached to the breast. At all stages, including the last, the infant, though in transition from internal to external objects, may and should be given a sense of omnipotence and of magical control. By magical, Winnicott means the creative aspects of experience. The infant who feels omnipotent, confirmed in its illusion that it creates the object of its desire, has the best chance to find its way to a more realistic kind of contact with the increasing number of things which call for its attention as it grows and develops. In these transitional states, the infant enters what Winnicott calls an intermediate area of experience, unchallenged in respect of its belonging to inner or external shared reality. It constitutes the greater part of the infant's experience, and throughout life is retained in the intense experiencing that belongs to the arts and to religion and to imaginative living and to creative scientific work. At this point in his afterword, Poirers relates Winnicott's findings to William James' views expressed in an essay in which James says certain experiences can lead some to others by means of a distinctly characterized intermediary experiences, in such a fashion that some play the role of known things, the other that of knowing subjects. The attributes subject and object represented and representative thing and thought mean then a practical distinction of the utmost importance, but a distinction which is of a functional order only and not at all ontological as understood by classical dualism. Finally, things and thoughts are made of one and the same stuff, which as such cannot be defined but only experienced. Unquote on James. Commenting on James and Winnicott's views, Poirier says, think for a moment what happens to things, to objects in James' intermediary experience or in Winnicott's intermediate area of experience. It is an area unchallenged in respect of its belonging to inner or to external reality. It is precisely in this area, first created by the infant, that adult creation also takes place. An example of this kind of adult creation came immediately to my mind, having read it somewhere. Listen to Jonas Salk inventor of the polio vaccine, described his understanding of the process of discovery. I don't remember exactly at what point I began to apply this way of examining my experience, but very early in life, I would imagine myself in the position of the object in which I was interested. Later, when I became a scientist, I would picture myself as a virus or a cancer cell and try to sense what it'd be like to be either. I could imagine myself as an immune system, try to reconstruct what I would do as an immune system engaged in combating a virus or cancer cell. Before long, this internal dialogue became second nature to me. I found that my mind worked this way all the time. To sum up, what we have in Winnicott's transitional objects is psychoanalytic confirmation of what I've described as Poteat's primal ground, a mother minding her child, rocking to the rhythms of her body's beating heart, the in and out of her breathing, intoning the child with her voice and the texture of her touch. This is the primal place, where divisions of subject and object, intelligence and emotion, body and mind do not obtain. This is the primal source of metaphor, words spoken and unspoken. Out of this place, this Eden, the child playing king of the world emerges as the adult who becomes a virus and saves the world from polio. And so also for William Poteat, at dusk on an October evening in Athens, torn apart, dismembered by the sight of a lusty, powerful, and spirited statue of a bronze horse, through that dancing figure remembers himself as a brother to Vangelis and heir of Orpheus, who bids him sing before and beyond his literacy the music and lyrics of the Polanyian Meditations. For myself, the question I once posed, what good are words, has begun to be answered. Words, especially metaphors, spoken and unspoken, call my worlds into being. As my senses bring me to them, words bring me to my senses. For understanding this gift, I am deeply indebted to William H. Poteat, my teacher and my philosophical therapist. In gratitude to him, I leave with you this poem from another Orphic voice, Elizabeth Sewell. The title of her poem is Ideas. The coming of new forms is priestly and warlike. Doubled they campaign, ringing, besiege the head with holy storms, till shouts and trumpets crack the glassy air, fortifications spill, and we lie open to fury and sack. And then to all the expanses of the plain, the world's wide landscape suddenly appears, and 9 huge stars waiting above the hill will march through walls of clay dust to the brain and camp there silent, leaning on their spears. You're